Good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here at the celebration of the Golden Jubilee of ICSSR. Obviously, it's been a long journey, and what I'm going to try and speak about today is how the field of economics is radically changing from what perhaps it was over these 50 years of this journey. And it's not a change that's just happening in India, it's globally. We are beginning to see this field of economics go through very major shifts, almost comparable to the kinds of shifts, say, the field of physics underwent in the early part of the 20th century, when quantum physics and other forms of new ways of thinking about the world replaced the old Newtonian way of thinking about the world. And in fact, there is a direct correlation because, as I will argue, the way we think about economics is itself continues to be captured by that old Newtonian framework. And now, in the last few decades, we have begun to see a significant shift away from that way of thinking. Of course, its roots of these changes lie in earlier era of economists, but finally we are beginning to see this new way of thinking find its way into a much more mainstream, whether it's in policy making, and application, or in academia. Now, what was the 19th and 20th century way of thinking over economics? Not many people realize that to a very large extent this way of thinking about economics was based on a framework that was essentially derived from Newtonian mechanics. This is why you hear so many mechanical and hydraulic terms in economics. You'll hear about the levers of fiscal and monetary policy. You'll hear the term liquidity, which is a hydraulics term. And of course, the term equilibrium, which is very much a Newtonian physics term. Now, essentially what it meant was that the way we thought about the economy was that it was some sort of a gigantic machine. And not just a gigantic machine, some would argue a Victorian steam engine running on fixed rails, except we economists called it the trend line. Now, if for some reason the economy was slowing below the trend line, the idea was to shovel in more coal, and it was speeding up too fast, you pull the brakes. But the essence of economics was essentially the idea of it being a gigantic machine. Now, this doesn't mean that there weren't major debates in 20th century economics, but it's quite extraordinary that both the market-oriented view of economics and the socialist view of economics essentially both derived their thinking from this essentially Newtonian framework. Of course, I'm simplifying here, but both of them essentially had the idea that there was such a thing as an optimal equilibrium that you need to aspire for. The difference between the two lines of thinking was that the socialists were of the opinion that this optimal equilibrium could be attained by asking some wise planners sitting in the planning commission. And the market economists were of the view that if you allowed markets to function, then the markets would somehow naturally take you towards this optimal equilibrium. But mind you, both of them agreed that there was such a thing as an optimal equilibrium. Now, what if the economy is not a gigantic machine? What if, in fact, there is no such optimal equilibrium? In fact, what if the economy is actually a gigantic organic ecosystem, much more like a biological system, that is being continuously buffeted by all kinds of unpredictable shocks? It could be technological shocks, it could be geopolitical shocks, it could be domestic political shocks, it could be a natural disaster. Many kinds of shocks are hitting this ecosystem, and this ecosystem is continuously evolving forward. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the world of unintended consequences, of butterfly effects. Effectively, as those of you who are familiar with chaos theory can clearly see where I'm going. This is a description of something which is now widely used in natural sciences and is called a complex adaptive system. There are many kinds of complex adaptive systems in the world. Some of them, of course, in the natural world are things like weather systems, for example. But even artificially, human-created systems exist which can be classified as complex adaptive systems. So, for example, you have the English language. The English language doesn't have an equilibrium. It is continuously evolving. It is adding words, usages, and so on. It doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as English language. There is something called an English language, but it's fiendishly difficult to define exactly what it is, and it's continuously evolving. One could argue that the Hinduism as a religion is a complex adaptive system. Cities are complex adaptive systems. Financial markets are complex adaptive systems. And of course, as I am arguing, economies are also complex adaptive systems. Now, the problem with complex adaptive systems is that there is no obvious way to predict exactly where it's going to go. It is not deterministic. And so, what happens here is that you are now entering into a world of very radical uncertainty. And this is particularly important to me as a policymaker, because half the time I am dealing with partial information. I have no real idea what will lead to. I may put a lot of emphasis on a particular line of activity, but then technology changes and it becomes completely irrelevant. A very big shock has a small impact. A very small shock can have a very large impact. When I am living in this environment of radical uncertainty, the way we think about economics then suddenly becomes very, very different. There isn't, as I said, an obvious optimal equilibrium to aspire for. It doesn't matter whether you're a socialist or a markets economist. So the question then arises, how do human beings make decisions in an environment of such uncertainty? It turns out that human beings use certain ways in doing this, and much of modern economics is really about trying to understand this, anticipate it, and also to build on it, and also to create systems that can deal with this universe of uncertainty. So what do human beings do, whether it's policymakers or consumers or businesses, do when facing this uncertainty? Well, let's be clear. None of us know where the demand schedule is or the supply schedule is. Even a large company like Apple will not be able to tell you what the demand graph or the supply graph of their most important products are. So how do ordinary people deal with this? Well, it turns out, and a lot of research has now been done into it, some of it coming in, interestingly, from the field of psychology, that human beings essentially do not optimize, they satisfice. i.e., they use rules of thumb to make their way through the world. Now, economists like complicated words, so we call these rules of thumb heuristics. And there are many ways in which we derive these heuristics. But since I don't have the whole day to go through them, I'll talk about two ways in which they do it. One is by responding to context, and the other is by trial and error. These are the two most important ways in which human beings derive their rules of thumb. So I'll give you a few experiments that were done, mostly psychology type experiments, in the US about 3-4 decades ago. One of them is a very well-known experiment, which is the prisoner experiment. I think this experiment, if I remember correctly, was done in Stanford. It's a very famous experiment, but it tells you, it's a good illustration of the context point, which is that the professors took a class of students and randomly divided them into prisoners and jail keepers. So essentially, one group of people were entirely artificially given power over another, and then they were left alone. Now, within a very, very short period, it was discovered that those who were the jailers were bossing around the prisoners. A little bit later, it was found that some of this bossing around was not just bossing around, but actually was beginning to become sadistic. And a few hours later, it had become so sadistic that those who were carrying out the experiment began to genuinely get afraid that somebody would hurt somebody else. Now, this is so bizarre. These are classmates, many of them are friends. There's no particular difference between them. And yet, one bunch is willing to do things which genuinely hurt the other. Why do they do it? Because of the context. Incidentally, I also do a very similar thing. I happen to be somebody who's lived many years abroad, but I also had a home in India. So I continuously go back and forth between India and Singapore. When I drive in Singapore, I follow all the rules. When I come back, get out of the thing and drive in Delhi, I drive like a lunatic. In fact, if I wasn't driving like a lunatic and actually following the rules, I'll probably cause a car crash because nobody else is following the rules. Now, you know exactly what I mean. Why do I behave like this? Because I'm responding to context. Now, it turns out that human beings in the economy will also essentially respond to context. Now, why does this matter in terms of economic policy? It matters because the business culture of a country today does not come into any equation that we normally talk about. When most economists discuss, business culture doesn't seem to be a major issue. The rule of law, for example, is almost assumed to exist, and if it is a problem, then economists assume that it is something for the judiciary or somebody outside their area of study who should be doing something about it. You'll rarely find, very rarely, there may be some law and economics journals where you'll have some reports, but mainstream economics will very rarely discuss the role of rule of law, enforcement of contracts, and so on. And yet, the point I'm making is that this is precisely what you should think about. The business culture of a country, the trust systems of a country, in the new kind of economics that I'm talking about, have an enormous influence on the way things evolve. And I will come back to it just a little bit later. Now, I'm going to talk about other ways in which human beings try to create rules of thumb. Now, how many of you have dogs? Let's see. Nobody has dogs? There's a gentleman there with a dog. Okay. There are quite a few people here with dogs. Okay. Now, most of you will take these dogs and go out to the park and throw a frisbee. And the dog will run after the frisbee and catch the frisbee. Right? Even if you don't own a dog, I'm sure you've seen this in a park. Not many people give much thought to this. They just throw the frisbee and the dog catches the frisbee. But if you were a mainstream economist, this is not what you would do. You would first go to the park and measure the speed of the wind. Then you would do a lot of studying of the shape of the frisbee. Then you do a lot of research into the breed of the dog and your muscle strength. And then you would feed this all into an Excel sheet and create a general equilibrium model. After many iterations, this CGE model, computable general equilibrium model, will spit out a forecast. And if you're a policymaker like me, you'll take this forecast to the Frisbee Policy Committee, who will then give you forward guidance. Now, you'll take the forward guidance and you'll go to the park and you'll tie the dog to the stake where the forward guidance says that the frisbee should land. Then you'll go back and you will throw the frisbee. And 99% of the time, the frisbee will land somewhere other than where the forecast said, and your dog will fail to catch the frisbee. Now, the only person who will be surprised by this are the economists. Meanwhile, all the non-economists are throwing their frisbee and their dogs are catching the frisbee. So, what are they doing? Now, if you observe a dog, what do? Effectively, the owner of the dog broadly indicates in which direction he or she is going to throw the frisbee. The dog goes and then stands in front. Then the frisbee is thrown. Then the dog runs along. And they look at the frisbee, they run along. Look at the frisbee, run along. Look at the frisbee, run along. And then, as it comes down, you jump and you grab the frisbee. What is the dog doing? The dog is essentially doing feedback loop and adjust. It needs only a broad indication of the direction. After that, it is all feedback loop and adjust. Does it sort of vaguely sound like how the GST was introduced? When we tried to introduce the GST, everybody told us we must have a perfect model of how it must be done. But in fact, it is impossible to tell in a complex world. You introduce it, all kinds of unintended consequences were going to happen. The only known way of introducing a major change is in fact to broadly get something together, begin to implement it, and then feedback loop and adjust. And this is the only way you can actually introduce very major changes. When the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code was introduced in 2016 and then began getting implemented in 2017, we actually had no idea what would happen when we did it. Because using a major change that was going to change the business culture of the country, it was going to change the way the banks were going to be run. And very importantly, it was actually going to introduce creditor rights for the first time. Now notice here how the banks were going to be cleaned up using Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The original thinking of many economists, traditional economists, was that this should not even be attempted, rather we should create something called a bad bank. Now, if we had used a bad bank, what would have happened? We would have taken all these bad assets and stuck it into this bad. And there they would have, we know from the BIFR experience, they would have festered there for years. Meanwhile, we would have recapitalized the banks and they would have gone back to doing whatever they were doing before. Instead, we decided to do something much, much more painful, which was to actually bankrupt them. But why are we doing this? Because by doing this, we are fitting into the framework that I just described. In a world where we cannot predict the future in any meaningful way, the only thing that you can do is to have a sensible exit system. This is critical to economics without equilibrium, number one. Number two, when we introduce this change, simply recapitalizing the banks right up front would have been a bad idea, because the banks would have gone back to doing whatever they're doing before. So you have to introduce some pain into it. I'm sorry, it is going to be painful. It's going to be painful for the banks, and it's going to be painful for the industries that are going to be bankrupted. This is one of the reasons nobody likes doing it. But in economics without equilibrium, you have to have a system of creative destruction. And I'm using this word because I want to show you that some of these ideas of this new economics are not entirely new. This term, creative destruction, comes from Schumpeter. He actually came up with it in the 1940s. An Austrian branch of economics, of course, came up with, used some of these terms. Similarly, you had Herbert Simon, who used the word satisficing, again, a 1950s term. This idea that people do not optimize, but they make do using rules of thumb. But these ideas, however, even though some of these people, including another Hayek, for example, is another great Austrian school economist who also believed in this general line of thought, although they won great acclaim, some of them even won Nobel Prizes, but it never became mainstream, despite the fact that in his 1970-71 Nobel Prize speech, Hayek actually mocked his fellow economists and gave a full speech on what is called the pretense of knowledge. So, what is this new economics all about? The new economics is about, first of all, jettisoning this deterministic, general equilibrium view of economics. This new economics simply says there is no such thing. We live in a continuously changing, evolving environment which doesn't have any particular path. It is for us to make that path, but when we do, we have to also be sure that we do not know exactly how our actions today will pan out. So, one of the interesting implications of the new economics is flexibility will always beat planning. Two, that rigidity in your plans is much more risky than the quality of your plan. In fact, it is better not to have a plan than to have a rigid plan. And I'm going to illustrate this with one example because I know I'm running out of time. That doesn't come from the field of directly from economics, but it comes from the field of urban design. But of course, urban economics also will derive from this. And I'm going to use this to end my talk. Whenever you come to India and you ask people, do our cities need more planning? So everybody agrees we need planning. Then you ask them, which is the best designed city in India? And they'll all jump up immediately, Chandigarh must be the best designed city in India. Then you ask them, okay, which is the best designed, planned city in the world? And after some thought, 99% of the people in my experience say Singapore. So the impression you get is if Chandigarh gets up in the morning, eats healthily, does yoga every day, it will become Singapore. Nothing could be further from the truth, because in fact they have diametrically opposite worldviews. So let me illustrate this. In 1965, the city of Chandigarh basically came together. So it had been built over the previous decade, and Le Corbusier had laid out an ideal end state plan for this city, what an ideal city would be. Of course, he came from the Newtonian worldview. He literally called cities as machines for living. And he laid out this plan, and how do you build a machine? Where you come up with a blueprint and you very meticulously lay out, according to that plan, that city. So that is what was done for Chandigarh. Singapore became free at about the same time. Singapore was actually a very poor city at that time. It had slums, it had all kinds of drug cartels, Chinese gangs. There were regular communal riots with the Malays, between the Chinese and the Malays and the Indians. And in fact, it was so poor that the Federation of Malaysia threw it out of its federation. The S in Malaysia actually comes from Singapore. It was originally called Malaya. They didn't change their name back, but they did throw out Singapore from the federation because it was considered to have absolutely no prospects. So what did Singapore do? Lee Kuan Yew only had one asset, which was that he had these abandoned British naval dockyards. So he converted them into becoming a shipping dockyard for container shipping. And he began to encourage light manufacturing. It was a very poor country then in the 1960s, so their first area that they got into was cheap rip-off garments, ready-made garments, particularly fake ready-made garments. Those of you who have ever looked at a brand called Crocodile, well, it was originally started as a rip-off of Lacoste, the Singaporean brand. And this plan worked so well that by 1980 or so, it was too successful to be any longer doing garments. So it moved up the value chain and became a area for doing electronics manufacturing. So many of you who have been to Singapore in the 80s and 90s will remember you all go to Mustafa and buy cheap electronics. So that was what they were doing for 2 decades. By 2000, they had succeeded in this also so much that they moved up the value chain into finance, education, and entertainment. Today, many people go to study in Singapore. Nobody in 1965 would have dreamt of going to Singapore to study. So what exactly was Singapore doing? Singapore was essentially doing feedback loop and adjust. It did not know in 1965 that it would be a great place for education 40 years later. Meanwhile, what has Chandigarh done? Chandigarh has stuck to the original plan that Le Corbusier laid out. So it is still essentially a subsidy scheme for civil servants. Nothing of commercial, economic, or artistic value has come out of Chandigarh itself. Even the buzz, to the extent it sees it, comes from outside the plan from Mohali. Or if you have Nek Chand's garden, remember always that Nek Chand's garden is technically illegal. It was not a part of the plan. So the point I'm making to you is this. Adaptation will always beat great plans. This is a very, very important learning from the new economics. Therefore, as you can see the kinds of policies we are putting in place, we are far more interested in things like the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. We are far more interested in creating frameworks of governance for example, like the GST. When we implement them, we do not expect to get it right the first round because we don't think it's possible to get it the first round, but we will iterate and get it right. And this line of thinking will tell you roughly what, if given an opportunity to take this line of thinking forward, what is it that I will attempt to do in the next few years. And let it be adequately clear, the complexity theory and this new economics makes it absolutely clear that the next round of reforms has got to do with reforming the legal system. Because in an uncertain world, the only thing that can anchor economic activities is the ability to enforce contracts. And you have to function with the assumption that things will from time to time go wrong. So the only anchors you can provide is not some great plan, not a good business plan, not a great forecast, but the relationships and the ability to enforce contracts. And therefore, we cannot hope to be a next generation 21st century economy with 34 million cases stuck in our legal system. So this has got to be the single most important area of reform. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.